Alright, hello Algebra 1. So today we're looking at completing the square. And if you're looking at the numbers, you may notice I skipped a few sections. That's because the sections I skipped were things that were largely graphing. And I'm going to take a wild guess and say most of you probably don't have graph paper lying around at home. And while there are graphs on the back of here, it's kind of hard to see. I'd have to keep doing this. And honestly, this stuff that we're about to hit is more important anyway. So if we have some time after we're done with this stuff, I may throw a graphing thing up on Desmos, but it'll be more for, okay, here's what this is and what you can do with it as far as graphing rather than like out of the book homework stuff. So that might be an extra credit thing towards the end of the quarter, but we're not going to worry about that right now. We'll just make sure to hit graphing parabolas real hard when we get to Algebra 2. Okay, so we're looking at perfect squares. And if you think back to when we were foiling things like this out, this is really the same thing as this. Because whenever you're squaring something, that's the same thing as taking it times itself. So this is really this. And so far we've been doing that part. We've been going from this to this. Today we're going backwards. But in order to go backwards, I'm going to take that one more step and FOIL this out and go, well, this is x squared times outside 3x inside another 3x. Last is 9. And then we get x squared plus 6x plus 9. And if you do that with a bunch of perfect squares, you're going to notice a pattern. This number is always whatever number you started off with squared. And this number is always that number times 2. Which means that if we want to get this number, and we have this one, this number is going to be half of this number squared. So we're taking half of it, and we're squaring it. So half of 6 is 3. 3 squared is 9. That bit is probably a thing you want to jot down, because that's what's going to help us figure out what we need to do to make our thing a perfect square. So it's a perfect square if we can turn it back into one of these and say it's x plus something squared. And in order for that to be happening, this number needs to be half of that and then squared. Okay. First thing we're doing is we're just figuring out what is that number. So what number do we need to have there in order to make it a perfect square? So if I've got a 10 here, again, we're just taking half of this number and then we're squaring it. So half of this number squared. Half of 10 is 5. 5 squared is 25. And if that's not one you know off the top of your head, 5 probably is. But if it was something bigger, feel free to just plug that into your calculator. So half of 10 is 5. 5 squared gives you 25. So if we're just looking for what that last number is, that's half of this squared. And that doesn't change if it's negative, because technically what I've got here is a negative 14, and technically what I'm doing is I'm taking half of that, which is negative 7, and squaring it. But when you square it, it ends up positive anyway, so we're just going to ignore that negative. And again, just a heads up that if you are putting that negative there and plugging it into your calculator, parentheses around the negative 7, because if you just do this, it's going to take 7 squared and then stick a negative in front of it. That's not what you want. So parentheses, or again, you can just ignore the negative because it's about to cancel itself out when you multiply by it anyway. So 7 squared is 49. So if we're just looking for that last number, that's just a number. So we're just taking half of this and squaring it. Half of 100 is 50. 50 squared is, and this might be one you don't know off the top of your head. Now, if you happen to notice that 5 squared is 25, so 50 squared is just 25 with a couple of zeros tacked down the end. Cool. If you plug that into your calculator, that's fine. Not the main point here. Okay, so if we're just looking for C, that's all we're doing. We're just taking half of that middle number and we're squaring it. Now, you're probably looking at that going, well, what do we do with that, Miss P? What's that good for? I'm about to show you exactly what it's good for. it's good for things like this. Because if we have a perfect square here, so this is 8 and 16, so half of 8 is 4, 4 squared is 16. This one's already a perfect square. The reason we want perfect squares is we can take them and turn them back into things that look like this. And this is going to be an x. This number is always going to be that half of this. And if that's plus, it's plus. If it's minus, it's minus. Just like this one we were doing back here with the 3. That 3 is half of that 6. And now that we have that, that makes it easier to solve. Because if we're just looking at this and trying to solve it, well, I mean, you could square root it to get rid of a squared, but then you've got this giant mess, and you don't really want to do that because we don't know how to take the square root of 8x. So that's going to be an easier thing to do if we have this, because now we've only got 1x, and importantly, everything over here is now inside your squared. So now if we square root it, all that's going to do over here is cancel out that squared. That's not going to be a square root of x. That's not going to be a square root of 4, which would be 2. That's not going to do any of that. All that's going to do over here is cancel out that squared. That's it. This is going to stay an x plus 4. Now, the thing you want to watch out for, and the tricky thing over here, is if we're looking at the square root of 81, technically it has 2. You're probably thinking of 9. And if you plug the square root of 81 into your calculator, what you will get is 9, because the calculator automatically assumes that's the one you want. The other one you technically have is a negative 9. So anytime you have a square root, you have a positive and a negative. Now, technically you also have that over here, but either that negative would cancel out with this negative, or it would not cancel out. You'd have this. So, yeah, technically you have it over here too, but this is the one we're worried about. Okay, so big thing with that is just remembering that that's a thing. So we want 2 answers rather than 1. And now, these are nice because these are just one-step equations. Now we know how to solve these. We're getting rid of adding 4 by subtracting 4. So once you're here, it's just solving. We just need to remember that there are actually 2 things that we're solving. We're solving this, and we're solving this. So we're going to end up with 2 answers for most of these. There are a couple exceptions. There are cases where you'd only get 1. There are also cases where you wouldn't get any. But for right now, we're just dealing with the ones where you have 2. So we're only worried about the ones where we have 2. We're going to get 2 answers for all of these. 9 minus 4 is 5. These 4's are going to cancel out 2. Negative 9 minus 4 is a negative 13. So those are our 2 answers there. Alright, so that's why we want perfect squares, because once we have a perfect square, we can do this. Now we're going to take a look at what happens if we don't start off with a perfect square, because most things are not perfect squares. What if I got something like that? That's not a perfect square. 1 is definitely not half of 8 squared. So, first thing we want to do is want to figure out what does that last number need to be. So that's what we were doing with the C before. We want to figure out what do we need to change that number into in order to have a perfect square. And you may notice that 8 from the last problem, we wanted x squared plus 8x. And the reason that worked with the last one is we had a 16 there. Now, in order to get that 16, the question is, what do we need to add to that 1? And please don't just say stick a 6 at the end. I mean, yeah, technically that would give you 16, but don't do that. So, in order to get up from 1 to a 16, what we're actually adding is 15. But, if we add 15 to this side, we've got to add 15 to that side. So we're going to add a 15 over here too. So now we've got the x squared plus 8x plus 16 that we want, because now it's a perfect square. And then we're going to take that, and it equals 10 plus 15 is 25. Yay! Because now it's a perfect square. And the reason we wanted a perfect square is now we can take it and we can do this. Same thing we did with the last one. So once you're here, it's the same steps we had on the last problem. So now we've got that 8 plus 4 we had before equals 25. This is squared. Don't forget that. Even though it's about to cancel out. So now we want to get rid of that squared with square rooting. So we're going to square root that. We're going to square root that. And over here, we've got an x plus 4, because again, the only thing that square root does is get rid of that squared. That's not going to square root this, it's not going to square root that, it's just canceling this. That's gone, that's gone. And the square root of 25 is either 5, which is probably the one you're thinking of, or it's negative 5. So you want to make sure we've got both of them. So once we're here, once you take that square root, you want to make sure you got both answers. And really the big thing there is just remembering that that's a thing you need to do, rather than just going, oh, 5, and solving that one. Nope, there's another way you need to solve. It's not going to take you that long to solve, but you do need to remember to do it, because you want both answers. And now we're subtracting 4. Those 4s are gone. 5 minus 4 is 1. And we're subtracting 4. Negative 5 minus 4 is a negative 9. And there we go. We got our 2 answers. We are good. And again, any of these, if you want to check them, feel free to go back and plug them in. So if I'm looking at that 1, I can go, well, 1 squared, which is 1, plus 8 times 1, which is 8, plus another 1, 1 plus 8 plus 1, yep, that's 10. That checks out. Okay, negative 9 squared is 81. Negative 9 times 8 is a negative 72, plus 1. So 82 plus a negative 72, okay, that also gives me 10. That checks out. And that part, feel free to plug it into your calculator if you're not sure off the top of your head what 81 plus a negative 72 plus 1 is. Not the main point here. So that's just checking to see if we got our answers right. And again, you should end up with 2 of them. And let's throw one more of those. Okay. Ooh, what if we got a minus here? Actually, let's make this minus 2. Lots of negatives. Miss P loves negatives. Okay, so first thing we want to do here is figure out what do we need this number to be in order to make it a perfect square. So again, we want half of this number squared. So half of 12 is 6. Again, technically a negative 6, but we're about to square it, which is going to turn it positive anyway. So we want this to be an x squared minus a 12x plus a 36. And the question is, what do we need to do in order to get there? Now, these ones you want to watch out for. This isn't 3. This is negative 3. So we want to get from a negative 3 up to a positive 36. Now, if you happen to know off the top of your head what you need to add to get from negative 3 to positive 36, cool beans. If you're not sure off the top of your head, one thing you can do is we can add 3 to both sides for starters. Because that gets me to 0 here. And then in order to get from 0 up to a 36, we're just going to add another 36. So if you weren't sure off the top of your head that the number we wanted to add was 39, you can just add it in 2 parts instead. Add a 3 and then add a 36. It'll get you to the same spot. And 61 plus 3 plus 36 is 100. And now we're doing the same thing we were doing before. So the reason we wanted this in the first place is now we can take it and we can turn it into one of these. And the only difference if that is a minus, and the reason I wanted to throw at least one that was a minus in here, the only thing that changes is instead of a plus here, we're going to have a minus. And that's going to be that 6 because that's half of 12. So that half of whatever this number is, that goes here. Okay, and the reason we wanted that is now we can square root it. And we've got an x minus 6 over here, because again, that just cancels out this squared. That doesn't turn that into the square root of 6 or something. So again, x minus 6 equals, and the square root of 100 is either 10, and that's probably the one you were thinking of, or negative 10. And again, just want to make sure that you've got them both. Okay, and then we're adding 6. And we're adding 6. Blink, blink. And 10 plus 6 is 16. Negative 10 plus 6 is a negative 4. Alright. Alright, and that is pretty much that. Go ahead and check out the homework in the description, and I'll see you in the next video.